March the 9th, 1652, Warsaw. Picture the same chamber running long, the way government sessions always seem to, then and now. Deputies packed onto benches, the air thick with candle smoke and impatience. The business on the table isn't ceremonial. The Commonwealth is bleeding money and soldiers into an uprising in the East, and this session is supposed to settle new taxes to pay for it. Time runs out before the vote does. The Marshal of the Sejm, a man named Andrzej Maximilian Fredro, proposes the obvious fix. Extend the session a couple of days, finish the job. A minor envoy from a small district called Upita gets to his feet. His name is Władysław Szczeciński, and up to this exact moment, nobody outside his own region has any reason to know it. He says two words: Nie pozwalam, I do not allow. Then he walks out of the chamber. And that's it. Not a vote against him, not a formal challenge to his standing, not even much of an argument, because under the rules, everyone in that room had sworn to respect. There didn't need to be one. A single objection from a single man nobody had heard of was enough to legally dissolve the entire session. Every law already debated, every tax already discussed, gone the moment he cleared the doorway. The king tries to salvage it, pushing the deadline to the following Monday, on the condition that Szczeciński comes back and withdraws his objection. He doesn't come back. One voivode in the chamber, a man named Jakub Szczawinski, reportedly curses him on the spot. May he perish. And the assembled senators are said to have answered back, in chorus, Amen. Here's the thing worth sitting with before we go any further. This wasn't a loophole somebody found. It was the system working exactly as designed, and the same mechanism that let one obscure man freeze an entire government would, within a century, help bring down one of the largest states in Europe. That's where this is going. But to understand how a single no could carry that much weight, you first have to understand who these people were. Because Poland-Lithuania's nobility wasn't like nobility anywhere else on the continent. Start with the name itself, since even that turns out to be more complicated than it looks. The Polish word is Szlachta, and it comes from Old High German Szlachta, meaning roughly family or lineage. Simple enough. Except by the 17th century, the Szlachta themselves had lost track of where their own name came from, and started assuming it was related to a different German word, Schlachten, to slaughter, a warrior class, mistaking its own family name for a butcher's word. Nobody corrected them. Why would you correct a myth that makes you sound more dangerous? That wasn't the only story they told about themselves. Polish nobles widely believed they were descended from the ancient Sarmatians, a nomadic warrior people the Greeks and Romans had written about centuries earlier. Nowhere near Poland. There's no genealogical evidence for this. None. It was invented in print in 1517 by a scholar named Maciej of Miechów, and the Szlachta adopted it anyway, because it gave them something ordinary European nobility didn't have. An origin story that set them apart from the West entirely. Closer, in their own telling, to warrior kings than to French counts in powdered wigs. So who were they, underneath the myth-making? By the 18th century, somewhere between 8 and 10% of the entire population of the Commonwealth held noble status. In the region of Mazovia, that number climbed past 20%. Compare that to France or England in the same period, where nobility sat at roughly 1 to 2% of the population, a genuinely tiny class, walled off from everyone beneath it. In Poland-Lithuania, you were more likely to know a nobleman personally than not. They even had a name for the state all these nobles had built together. Rzeczpospolita, Polish for Commonwealth, borrowed directly from the Latin res publica, the public thing. Not a kingdom that happened to have a parliament, a public thing, owned collectively, with the king as one office inside it rather than the point of it. And what that noble status meant was just as unusual. In 1505, an act called Nihil Novi, Latin, nothing new, established that the king could pass no new law without the consent of both chambers of the Sejm. Not advice, consent. From that point on, no Polish king ever again ruled the way his counterparts in Paris or Madrid did, Chancellor Jan Zamoyski put the whole arrangement into 5 Latin words that the Schlachter genuinely lived by. Rex regnat et non gubernat. The king reigns, but does not govern. Reigns, but doesn't govern. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a throwaway line. It's the actual operating principle of a European state, centuries before anyone was using words like constitutional monarchy, and the rights bundled into that principle went further than lawmaking. In 1573, the same year the first free election took place, the Schlachter signed the Warsaw Confederation, a formal, written pledge that Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox nobles would settle their religious differences without state violence. Look at the timing. This is roughly the same decade France was tearing itself apart in its wars of religion, and the same century most of the continent would spend burning itself down over exactly this question. Poland-Lithuania wrote the opposite promise into its own founding documents, and every elected king afterward had to personally swear to uphold it. The crown wasn't a rubber stamp, but it also wasn't the source of law, and increasingly, it wasn't the source of religious policy either. That belonged to the nobility, collectively, gathered in the same. And if you think a legislature that powerful must have come with real teeth to enforce it, you'd be right, which is exactly where the story gets dangerous. That teeth, they picked their own king, in person, by the thousands. Every 4 to 6 years, or whenever the throne genuinely sat empty, the Schlachter gathered at a field called Wola, just outside Warsaw, to choose the next king of Poland, not confirm him, not ratify a birthright, choose him out of whatever candidates, foreign princes, native magnates, sometimes total outsiders, put themselves forward. This system ran from 1573 all the way to 1764, 13 separate elections in total, and it was open, at least on paper, to every hereditary nobleman in the Commonwealth who could make the trip. Historians estimate that meant something like 500,000 men were technically eligible to show up and cast a vote for head of state. Nobody kept an official head count, so treat any precise figure here with suspicion, but the working estimate from Polish sources is that a typical election drew somewhere around 10 to 15,000 nobles to that field, occasionally spiking into the tens of thousands during a genuinely contested race. Even at the low end of that range, stop and compare it to what was happening everywhere else in Europe at the time. In France, the throne passed by bloodline, full stop, no vote, no field, no eligible 500,000. In England, succession disputes got settled by councils of a few dozen powerful men behind closed doors, not by open-air gatherings of the minor gentry. The first king chosen under Poland's new system, in 1573, was a French prince named Henry of Valois, and before he could so much as be crowned, he had to personally swear an oath to a document called the Henrician Articles, binding him to convene the same regularly and rule within limits the nobility had written for him, not the other way around. If that number surprised you as much as it surprised me the first time I ran into it, that's worth a like. It's genuinely how YouTube knows to put this in front of more people who'd find it as strange as we do. Now, here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting than biggest voting bloc in Europe. Because every one of those 500,000 eligible nobles was, in theory, equal under the law, regardless of what he actually owned. A landless Schlachtzix with no estate, no peasants, and no income beyond what he could scrape together working his own strip of land, the kind of noble contemporaries bluntly nicknamed Gołota, the naked ones, carried, on paper, the exact same vote, the exact same legal protection from arbitrary arrest, and eventually, the exact same power to freeze an entire same session as a magnate who owned dozens of villages and commanded a private army bigger than some royal garrisons. That's not a footnote. That's the entire tension this system was built on, and it's the tension that's about to start pulling the whole structure apart. So that's the shape of it. A nobility 10 times the size of France's, choosing its own king by the thousands, bound by a rule that made a penniless Szlachcic legally equal to a prince. This channel exists to pull exactly this kind of thing out from under the simplified version most people got in school. The real mechanics, not the highlight reel. If that's useful to you, subscribing means you catch the next one of these. Because equal on paper and equal in practice, it turns out, are two very different things. And that gap is what breaks everything from here. Here's the gap. The rule that lets Szymanski dissolve an entire saying with two words has a real name, liberum veto, Latin for free veto. And it wasn't dreamed up as sabotage. It grew out of something the Schlachter genuinely believed in. Every deputy in the Sejm was bound by specific instructions from his home region's local assembly, or Sejmik, and he wasn't there to substitute his own judgment for theirs. If the Sejm tried to pass something his region hadn't agreed to, blocking it wasn't obstruction. It was doing his job. Unanimity, in that light, wasn't chaos. It was a promise that no regional minority could ever be steamrolled by everyone else's majority. Now here's the part. Almost every retelling of this story gets slightly wrong, including, for a long time, my own understanding of it. The popular version says Szymanski's 1652 walkout was the liberum veto, fully formed. One man discovers a superweapon and uses it. The documented reality is messier and, honestly, more interesting. What Szymanski actually objected to was a procedural move, an illegal extension of the session past its legal deadline. He wasn't blocking a law, he was blocking an extension. It took decades, and a long line of deputies willing to push the interpretation further, before that precedent hardened into the wrecking ball version the 18th century would come to know. There's an even messier layer underneath that, if you keep pulling the thread. Some historians don't think Szymanski acted alone at all. The leading theory points to Janusz Radziwiłł, a powerful Lithuanian hetman and magnate, as the man who may have quietly set him up to it, using an obscure, replaceable envoy to do something a magnate couldn't do himself without consequence. If that's what actually happened, the very first liberum veto wasn't a lone nobleman defending his region's voice at all. It was a magnate pulling a string, the exact same arrangement we just saw with the Gołota, a small noble doing someone more powerful's bidding. The myth compresses a slow, ugly erosion into one dramatic afternoon, with one clean hero or villain at the center of it. Historians are still working out exactly how much of that erosion was accidental drift and how much was deliberate exploitation. Genuinely split, not textbook split. And if you've got a theory on which side of that line the early deputies fall on, the comments are the place for it. What isn't in dispute is where it ended up. Under King Augustus II, who ruled for 36 years, 10 of the 18 Sejm sessions held during his reign collapsed without passing a single law. His son, Augustus III, inherited the throne next, and across his own 30 years in power, exactly one Sejm session managed to get anything done. One out of dozens of attempts. Here's what that actually cost. In concrete terms, at full strength, the Commonwealth's entire standing army numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men, for a state that at its height covered close to 1 million square kilometers. That's not a typo, and it's not because Poland-Lithuania lacked the population to field a bigger force. It's because the body responsible for approving military budgets could be shut down by a single objection, year after year, and frequently was. This is not a story about a stubborn parliament having a rough decade. This is not a story about one unlucky king. This is the government of one of the largest states in Europe, functionally unable to pass a tax, fund an army, or fix a road for the better part of a century, while its neighbors spent that same century building the centralized, well-funded militaries that would eventually carve the Commonwealth apart. And foreign courts noticed. Russian and Prussian agents learned they didn't need to invade a Sejm session to kill it. They just needed to find and pay one deputy willing to stand up and say 2 words. By the early 1770s, that strategy had stopped being a rumor and become policy. Russia, Prussia, and Austria didn't need to defeat the Commonwealth militarily to start dismantling it. They needed compliant same sessions, and after a century of practice, buying those had become almost routine. In 1772, the three powers moved. They carved off roughly a third of the Commonwealth's territory between them, and then did something almost administratively cruel. They summoned a Sejm and demanded it ratify the theft, session by session, into legality. That's the room Tadeusz Rejtan walked into in September 1773. He was a deputy from Nowogrodzek, not a magnate, and not anyone with the standing to stop a partition through influence alone. What he had was a doorway. For roughly 36 hours, he refused to let the Sejm formally open the session that would ratify the loss, occupying the chamber, refusing to yield. When bribed deputies finally started walking out to force the vote through anyway, Rejtan threw himself down at their feet and dared them to walk over him rather than out that door. Some of them did. I want to be precise about this part because the image most people carry of that moment. Rejtan, half undressed, sprawled dramatically across the threshold, shirt torn open, comes from a painting. Jan Matejko finished it in 1866, nearly a century after the fact, as a piece of national revival art meant to stir a country that no longer legally existed. The documented core is real. The 36 hours, the blocked door, the trampling. The torn shirt is Matejko's addition, not an eyewitness's. Even Poland's most famous image of resistance turns out to be part fact, part legend, which feels, by this point in the story, almost fitting. Rejtan failed. The first partition was ratified, but something inside the Commonwealth had finally, genuinely woken up, and it took until 1791 to produce an answer big enough to match the problem. On May the 3rd of that year, the Sejm passed a document that historians consider the first modern codified constitution in Europe, and the second in the entire world after the United States. It did what nothing else had managed in over a century. Under King Stanisław August Poniatowski, it abolished the liberum veto outright, ended the free election of kings, and replaced both with a hereditary constitutional monarchy answerable to a functioning legislature. That's the loop closing. 139 years, from Szyczyński's 2 words in 1652 to a constitution finally strong enough to outlaw them in 1791. A century and a half for a nation to formally admit that the freedom it was proudest of had also been quietly killing it. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't in time. The Constitution survived barely a year before Russia crushed it by force. A second partition followed in 1793. A third, final one in 1795, erased the Commonwealth from the map completely. A country that had, at its height, run the widest noble franchise in Europe, gone. There's a version of this same argument still playing out today, in rooms with far better lighting. The European Union's foreign policy decisions still require unanimous agreement among member states, precisely because unanimity is supposed to protect smaller countries from being overruled by bigger ones. The UN Security Council runs on the same logic behind its veto power. Nobody's calling it liberum veto, but it's the identical bet that protecting every single voice from being outvoted is worth the risk that any one of those voices can freeze the whole room. Poland-Lithuania ran that experiment for 2 centuries, in public, at full scale. And that's the kind of detail that's genuinely fun to bring up at dinner, right up until someone asks how it ended. So where does that leave the Szlachta's noble democracy, once you strip away both the myth-making and the moralizing? 3 things worth carrying with you. First, the plain fact. For roughly 2 centuries, Poland-Lithuania ran the widest noble political franchise anywhere in Europe, an elected head of state, and a legislature that could legally overrule its own king, real, functioning self-government, generations before most of the continent would attempt anything like it. Second, the reframe. The same mechanism that made this system radically freer than its neighbors, unanimous consent, one voice equal to any other, is the exact mechanism that eventually made it ungovernable. Freedom and function weren't opposing forces here. For a long stretch, they were the same rule, right up until they weren't. And third, the part that actually stays with you. A system built to make sure no single voice could ever be silenced, ended up proving that no single voice should ever be allowed to silence everyone else, either. Two failure modes, same coin, and the Schlachter discovered both of them the hard way, using themselves as the experiment. Which leaves an honest question, and I mean this one sincerely. If you'd been born into this system, not a magnate, not a king, just an average Schlachtschik with a small plot of land and one equal vote, do you think you'd have used that vote to protect your neighbor's voice, or sold it to whichever magnate paid first? Be honest. Tell me below. Poland-Lithuania spent 200 years proving that a government built entirely on individual liberty is still a government, and still has to function as one. It's a lesson every generation seems to need to relearn on its own terms, in its own rooms, with its own version of a man standing up and saying two words nobody expected to matter.